Maddie, you've been doing a lot of work looking at measurement and how to measure impact with community groups here in Quebec. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you've been hearing in terms of how frontline workers or social service delivery organizations feel about measuring impact. Because one of the things actually that I heard Sir Ronald Cohen say recently in an interview is that the biggest fallacy about this market is that you cannot measure impact. So I'm wondering, what have you heard in your work?
I guess that what community organizations and social purpose organizations are wondering about social impact measurement is there anything new? We've been doing this for a long time. We have evaluation standards and indicators from many funders. So first question that they're asking, what is so new about this and what's the hype? The second issue that they seem to be addressing is the question of how can we access the resources? How do we get the funding to do the measurement? And I guess the third thing is that they want to be involved. So what we have been doing for the past somewhat years at Territoire Innovant en économie sociale et solidaire, I didn't ask you to say that one. So it's innovative territories in social and solidarity economy, is to group these people around this question of impact measurement. So first we wanted to unpack what is impact measurement. So when people are talking about impact measurement, are they actually talking about impact measurement? Most of the time, they seem to be more evaluating objectives, goals, outcomes, very rarely impact. Measurement of impact is something quite demanding methodologically. You have to establish causality, attribution, there's timeline. How do you know that this impact is actually the one that is produced by this intervention? When we started talking about it at the strategy group, the co-construction group for the federal government, we looked at a bunch of different financial tools for social finance and social innovation. And social impact bonds were not the one that we talked most about, and not all of us really thought they were such a fantastic tool. And what we did mention in the report is that there is controversy about it. So I think this needs to also be mentioned.
Discussed, okay. Erica, let me bring you in because the J.W. McConnell Foundation has invested in one SIB to date, and I think you're looking at investing in another one. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the promise of social impact bonds and what you think they have accomplished or might accomplish in the future.
Sure. So, and just I personally went from being very intrigued when social impact bonds came about to not liking them at all, and then to getting a little bit more involved in understanding them, and I think my view has shifted significantly, and I think that they do hold a significant promise as a mechanism that proposes new ways of financing. So the McConnell Foundation has been very interested for many years now in supporting social innovation and changing the root cause of issues. And we've been trying to support financial innovation and social finance at large, and we see social impact bonds as one tool of many multiple tools that are out there to support this. We're involved in the Heart and Stroke Foundation one. Just a clarification from the data point, there was mentioned that the target had changed from 40,000 to 7,000. That's not quite right. It's sort of like the 40,000 has remained as general population that you reach, out of which 7,000 that then got reduced to 10,000 to 7,000 are individuals that would be pre-hypertensive. So then you try to do the intervention for those. So far, the program is working well. It's working according to plan. What was interesting for me to learn in the process of getting involved in the Heart and Stroke Foundation one was, when I even started skeptical and sort of like the analysis, was the discussion that was happening at the table. Who was involved? Investors were not the ones that were choosing the metrics. It wasn't also the investors were not the ones that were picking and choosing from multiple potential interventions. Those specifications got determined by government and by the service provider. And then once the arrangement was established, then they came to us and said, would you like to be involved or not? And these are sort of like the terms, and we did the assessment. It's all in the detail of the design of the social impact bond, and I think that there's certainly questions to be raised about governance. Who's at the table deciding what? Where are beneficiaries involved? Are they part of the conversation? Are the nonprofits that are doing the service delivery, do they have a say? What room are you opening to investors to actually participate or not, and to decide or not? And I think that those are the things where you can actually have a program in place that is good, and it's going to be in service of the beneficiaries and not the investors. You don't want something that is just. I do not agree fundamentally with the position of let's do this for the money. And I think that at least in the programs that I've been involved in discussions, no investor has come in, certainly not the McConnell Foundation, from a profit-making standpoint. The new program, I'll just finish with this, the new program that we're looking to get involved in is flipping even sort of like the power dynamics, and the results and what's considered a success is determined by the communities themselves that would be receiving sort of like the program, and it's not the same as in some of the SIPs that we've seen around the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. I want to bring Margie in, but because when we made the film, I mean, we hear quite clearly the CFO from Heart and Stroke said it was an investor who came up with the idea for a payment trigger to be returned because of enrollment. And Malatest also said the same thing, you know, what do the investors want to pay out on? So it seems that there is some influence that investors have over the design of these, and I think the detail that you mentioned, you're right, it's very important. But Margie, you've been looking at these. What did you see in the film, or what have you seen in your research that you think is most problematic? Because you've come at SIBS from a more critical lens.
I maintain the critical lens with which I came to analyze and evaluate this new tool, this new financial tool. But in listening to Erica and what McConnell is doing, I mean, this is an approach which I don't think is a general approach. I do think it's very investor-driven. I'm very troubled by what I think is an ethical issue of commodifying social services, of taking an opportunity of vulnerability and using that opportunity to create a market. Now, this does not mean that everyone who's in there is a vulture capitalist or vulture venture capitalist and evil-minded. I think there's some very well-intentioned people, but I think your film is excellent. I really found the film very, it is provocative and it's going to generate debate. But when I finished watching it, I felt it should be seen by people in government. It should be seen by civil servants. It should be seen by people who are elected officials, and this kind of discussion should take place. What troubles me about this particular tool, first of all, it's not a bond. I wish they would call it something else. Social impact bonds are not bonds. A bond is a long-term security with steady returns. This is not a bond. These are very short-term. The rates vary. They are negotiated case by case, so let's call it something else. So if we're talking about something that is existing in the financial market, that's the first the first issue. The second, and it came up in your film, is that when you're dealing with issues of endemic poverty, and you're dealing with issues of children who are not able to move through the system in the way that you would wish, these are systemic issues, and by isolating a particular project, a particular initiative in a particular neighborhood, and not examining the context in which these situations are arising at a time when governments are cutting spending is, I think, quite dangerous, because it allows governments to get off the hook at a time when they have been retrenching over the last 30 years. So what comes up in your film and what comes up in the literature on social impact bonds, it's the low-hanging fruit that gets, that gets the investors interested, for good reason, because the risks are lower. So if you put all those pieces together, you've got these larger organizations that are low risk, therefore they will attract the investors at a time when governments are reducing spending and cutting back in social programs and social service provision. The smaller organizations are going to be hit twice. They're not going to be able to reach out to these investors because they're too risky, and they're also going to be suffering through the cuts that governments are introducing. So these are experiments, and they're scattered at a time when we have a loud call for systemic approaches that require collaboration. I mean, the kind of collaboration that Erica just described cannot just be on a one-on-one, case-by-case issue. There are ways in which governments can work differently and should. I think while we're all very nostalgic for the social safety net, it's clear that we can't go backwards. But how do we go forward and look at ways in which government, civil society, business can collaborate instead of what I see as a business model that is being applied to social services?
Sara, the CFC is looking at doing something very interesting, and that is being the outcome payer, which is the role usually occupied by government. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that social impact bond is about and why you would consider taking that on.
Sure. So what you're referring to is an experiment that we're running that we hope starts to address some of the critiques, both that we've already heard on this panel, which I take very seriously, and also some of the ones that are both subtly and quite directly raised in the film. So, issues of attribution, issues of what's called creaming, or sort of teaching to the test in terms of hitting those results, who sets the agendas, and who's accountable to who defines success, the role of the public sector versus the private sector, and the idea, and I'm very sensitive to this coming from the philanthropy sector, of staying in our lane vis-a-vis the role of government. So there's a lot of problems here, but I believe, and I think I agree with Erica on this, that there's something here that could be interesting if we can manage, that long list of tensions and many others as well. And so what we've been working on is an experiment in I wouldn't call it a social impact bond. It's a form of outcomes funding in which there's two innovations, really. The first innovation, and this is what Erica alluded to, is that the outcomes, we saw in the movie that there was the counting and the reading and all those things, in this outcomes program, those outcomes are defined, actually within community and, at the middle stage of the process rather than at the front stage. And so you don't get the Deloitte treatment, or whatever the name of that other company is, to give you the, what actually typically is a 70-page document of micro indicators and levels and payouts. And that comes from really a response to the way that, I know that movie and some of the ways we talked about people's lives kind of feels if you're sensitive and you're watching that movie, and the critiques that have already been raised on this panel. The second innovation is that the payer, so the organization that pays if things happen, is not in this instance government. And so Community Foundations of Canada has stepped forward to essentially assume this role of payer. We obviously are not just going to write a check for what will amount to millions of dollars, but we're stepping forward to say we'll assume that risk that there will be people, foundations, maybe governments and others who will pay for those outcomes, but in the meantime, we're going to unlock the system. And what that allows us to do, in a normal SIB, the mechanism is that government is essentially replacing costs. And so in the Peterborough example you saw in the film, you have those costs around what it costs to reincarcerate somebody. Could we avoid those costs, and therefore we've created a pool of money to pay for the front side intervention. And we're not beholden to those things because we're paying into a system that we don't already have a set of obligations around. And so we can be much more flexible, whether people are on some kind of social assistance, whether people graduate, all those things, because we're not already in a financial arrangement around those things, an obligation, we can be less directive around needing to replace those costs. So sort of a long-winded answer to say there's a lot of different things going on, and we certainly haven't figured it all out. But there's a curiosity, I guess, around if you take out some of those pressures around, who sets the agenda and why are they setting it? Does that allow power to be redistributed in new ways into this system?
And just quickly, so people understand what you're talking about, the program, is that
I could have said that.
the geothermal plant? Is that?
Yeah, so what the program is at its core is to install geothermal units on reserve in the province of Manitoba. And there's a sort of system around that. There's a social enterprise that actually does the installations. There's an intermediary that's actually structuring the fund, which is a Indigenous-led intermediary, and then we're kind of positioned as the payer. So essentially these units get installed, and from that there's a whole range of outcomes ranging from environmental or carbon outcomes to jobs, both in the short term and in the long term. Long-term savings, obviously, to people living in homes that have these kinds of energy efficiencies, et cetera. Maybe the very last thing I'll say is that part of what I think is particularly interesting about this example is this is I hesitate to use the word market, but this is a place in our system where I think, everyone ought to agree that there is a woeful inadequacy on the part of government to provide fairness, autonomy, adequate funding, et cetera. So I would like all those things to change. But in the meantime, there is a massive capital gap there are no alternatives. There are no bank loans, there are no business loans that are going to make these changes. And so again, this is an experiment in what happens if a social finance tool comes in to fill that gap, obviously with the intention that there'll be a long-run set of outcomes, but a consciousness that we do want to remember who ought to be paying for these things ultimately.
Are there alternatives? I don't know, Mary, you wanted to say something earlier, but.
I do too.
Oh, well,
Me too. Me too. If we get a
I guess
second
we all
chance.
want to say something, and probably people, I don't know if
Yeah,
this
we
is
should-
working.
This one?
Yeah, when you say, we have to give faith, have a leap of faith, I started to wonder, this is a pay-for-performance scheme, so, and there's a presumption that evaluation and metrics will give better outcomes. So I did what a university professor does. I went to the library and I looked for meta-analysis of, does it work? And it doesn't. And so we've been into pay-for-success programs before SIBs were invented. And so, just recent, American Journal of Public Health, just says, concerns include increased costs to government, restricted program scope, fragmented policy making, undermining of public sector service, mischaracterization of the root causes of social problems, entrenchment of systematically produced vulnerabilities. So this is what comes from this in the health system. In the education system, the Century Foundation will say, you know, we have proof that it can be harmful to performance in education. This virtuous circle has not been proven in the literature. And so what kind of faith should we have at this point?
Just a very quick comment, because I think we're mixing some things up here, and that's obviously not, it's not a bad thing. It's because the social impact bonds and the film that you made are targets very specific social areas of education and homelessness. You know, you brought up energy. I think we would all agree that we need to innovate on how we deal with these, you know, very critical issues. But yes, I mean, the literature on outcomes and impact is such that it says it's problematic. Jeff Mulgan, who's Mr. Innovation, Mr. Social Innovation, and was a big fan of social impact bonds, says that these are all supply-driven, and all supply-driven agendas by government have failed and are destined to be problematic. But I think what's important, at least in my case, is, you know, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're talking about a particular tool. We're not talking about innovation in social finance in general, solidarity finance, development capital, which we have a long history of in Quebec, and where we work in partnership, designing, co-designing. That came up in the film. You know, the necessity to go co-design these instruments. If I heard you right, I think what you're talking about is a process of co-design. I'm not sure. I'd like to know. I would like to know more. But the way the social impact bond was designed, it's short term. You're talking about outcome rather. The question of time is key. An outcome can take 2 years in one case and can take 20 years in another case. And to write something off because you haven't achieved the 3-year target of 75% success rate or what is extremely dangerous. And it's a lottery. I'm sorry. It's a bet on the lives of vulnerable people. And I am very committed to that view. But that's not the same as saying that we need to look innovatively at how we use financial tools, how public and private and civil society could work together. This is a form of public-private partnerships, and those have not had a very good track record.
There's a couple of things. So if we actually look at what was the origin of this and sort of like the rationale, it was, right now, we're spending most of our money downstream when things are just too hard, too costly. And if we actually moved upstream to do earlier interventions, we would be able to not only significantly improve the lives of people that are involved in those interventions, but also we would be probably reducing the costs of what we're funding right now. At that point in time, there was also the realization, and we're talking about governments cutting back for many, many years. Well, it's a pattern that doesn't seem to be reverting. Governments being stuck and saying, well, we currently do not have funding to go upstream because we actually need to be funding these emergency services and funding downstream. So this model came as a proposition of saying, well, what if we actually brought somebody else's money to support that early intervention that is going to provide all sorts of economic, social benefits downstream. Now, obviously, the question is, so the key point and rationale was to unlock a different kind of service delivery that would be better for everybody, for society. Are we achieving that? I think that there's all sorts of questions about whether it's really unlocking, and then the sort of like the uptake by government of some of these programs. So I think the conversation should be, well, then, how do we actually sustain these interventions long term? How do we actually expand it to more beneficiaries? How do we make them more financially sustainable and maybe bring in the right stakeholders to support them? I don't think social impact bonds are sort of like going to be this huge market. I don't think it's right to think that it's going to be sort of like their way of funding public services.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because the McConnell Foundation with the Boldness Project in Winnipeg, you've been funding innovation through grants for the past 4 years for Indigenous communities, and that's been very successful. So I think there's many ways to fund innovation. But let's get a question. Does anybody have a question from the audience for any of the panelists or something about the film that you were wondering?
I just wanted to better understand the mechanism of how the social impact bonds work. What I wasn't too clear on is whether there's always a profit motive of the investors get that 7% on the money that they spend, or is that profit also going back into the programs themselves?
From the research that I did with the film, there are actually programs that are the return on investment is being reinvested in the programs. And the investments have ranged from 1.3% to 22%. So there's a wide range. It really depends on the investor, and it depends on the motivation. But the idea is, like the original theory or thesis, was that there would be a dual return, so both a social and financial. And where people sit on that spectrum, I think, really depends on the investor.
But it's a valid. I think that's one of the great questions that we should be posing, sort of like moving forward. How are we defining these terms, right? Is there an opportunity to actually sit everybody at the table and say, well, if you're a foundation, do you really need to make 8%? Do you need to make 6%? It also, in the case of we have to remember. Depending on who the investor is, you have different types of regulations in terms of what you can do with your money or not. So it's not just a rich man coming in and saying, oh, I want to make more money than putting it in the stock market that is motivated like this. If you're going to have money from a pension fund or you're having money from a financial institution, they will not be able to put in money unless they make a minimum type of return. Us as foundations, it also depends. We have 3.5% of our, by law, 3.5% of our capital goes to grants. And then we have private foundations have endowments, and these are investments that get managed under certain types of minimum requirements of return. So if we want to use that money, then we would have certain specifications. But it's certainly a very important issue in terms of who's defining the rates of return, to what end, why, who's been part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. And I think the last point I would make is that we also need to, I think. If we try to make SIBs the solution for everything, then we hit a very hard wall, and it's probably the wrong approach. They really, because as you were mentioning, Margie, and as we've seen in the film, when we talk about poverty, when we talk about some of these issues, they're highly complex, and rarely one intervention is going to be the solution to everything. So just as the interventions need to be understood for what they are and not create greater expectations than what they can deliver, similarly, this is sort of like, okay, one financial tool that maybe if we work around some of the challenges, we can use it effectively to just trigger the beginning of a type of intervention, and then let's think more holistically about what is it that we need to, what are the types of interventions that we need to provide for better addressing a complex challenge, and similarly, what is sort of like the range of financial mechanisms that we're going to need to use in addition to this one if we have a good SIB intervention that is actually going to take us in the right direction.
I mean, we're having this conversation with foundations at the table, and I think if we had a venture capitalist or one of the people that was in the film, we would have to address this question differently, because they are there, and again, these are not evil people. They are being told that they can make money while doing good, and that's very appealing. And Mr. Cohen, or Sir Ronald Cohen, begins by saying we have to access capital markets. Capital markets work on the basis of profitability. So that's a reality. So the question then becomes, are we generating, are we creating a marketplace? Are we creating a marketplace for social services? That's very different from the way in which a foundation will engage, because foundations have the capacity to make to make grants. They have a capacity to have mission-related investments and program-related investments, and to mix all those up. and they are not there as a private investor or a group of investors or Goldman Sachs. You know, the Rikers intervention was the Bloomberg Foundation, and which was a foundation plus Goldman Sachs. The returns were very high, 13, 14, 15%. So it's so variegated, and of course these are not being presented as the solution, but they're coming at a time when you have austerity and government cutbacks and arguments to reduce the role of government, and that's where the danger lies, because then this pops up as having, you know, trillions and trillions of available dollars in capital markets that could come in and take the place of government. So I think that, you know, what's missing at the table here is not for that person to be attacked, but for that person, or maybe, yeah. but for that person to come and say, why are they, you know, why are they, I mean, we heard it, but why are they in that market? And they're in that market, they're good people, they want to do good, but they also want to generate competitive returns.
But the interesting thing about it, what we've heard on these panels that we've been doing across the country, because we've had different types of investors on the panel, and people are looking for something that is comparable to what they would get if they invested somewhere else in the market. And so,
Yeah,
I mean, the return for the heart and stroke, I think, is 8.8%.
It can be up to 8.
Yeah,
But it
which
does
is this,
range.
which is the same that J.B. Pritzker is getting in the States, you know? And the returns that Deloitte was talking about going out with Mainstay was between 10 and 12. So, I mean, there are philanthropic investors and venture capital investors that are looking to make the same return. But I think there is a difference, and it's not necessarily defined by where they sit in the investor world, but on the people behind it and how they've thought about it. Sorry, Marie. No.
What if we use that money to give the means to practice evaluation and learn management, go to appropriate management schools that know how to work with social purpose organizations? Should we not have the same results using public money, and instead of paying off private money, whether foundation or your capitalists, would it not come to the same increase in the capacity of producing impacts that we seem to be looking for in those schemes?
Just to jump off from what you've said, yes, probably, except we don't seem to be able to get that money to do that. I mean, for me, the question I'm left with is, you know, I'd be very happy if we spent the money in the way you've just suggested, or if governments could, you know, if things could stay in the public realm. The challenge is, you know, this money to do things in a preventative way or front end or, you know, drive measurement, it doesn't seem to be there. And I don't see what set of events is going to change that around. And so there does seem to be this need for capital. I have as many hesitations as anyone about the source of that capital and primarily the motivation of that capital. But I nonetheless see a huge gap in capital for things that don't fit in the 3 or 4 year government cycle, or that, you know, aren't tested, or that in fact do not set agendas. You know, I think this idea that capitalists set agendas and squeeze out communities, but governments are democratic and, you know, they don't squeeze communities or small charities, et cetera. I mean, that's definitely not true. Governments are the absolute worst to do business with when you're a small charity. So, you know, I do see some need for some new capital, and would want to put a lot of guardrails around that. And then finally, I think this idea that foundation capital, it's definitely not uniquely profit motivated like pure venture capital, But it's not as concessionary as I think we all imagine it would be, and it's extremely risk adverse, at least in 2018. And so I don't put a lot of faith in the capacity, both in terms of its size, but also its willingness to move, take risks, be concessionary, meaning, take low returns. That's nothing of scale is going to come from there anytime soon. So, what are we left with?
We can go on and on.
We probably have time for one more question, if anyone, yeah.
So I'm hearing we should be cautious about not creating a market for social services, but when we think of social finance tools, isn't there always this risk of creating a market for social services? I'd be really curious to hear about other tools like community bonds, long-term loans, and the differences.
Mm-hmm.
Social finance tools are not only in the social service sector. I think that's what's important. The social impact bonds are targeting, for the large part, social services. But when you look at the different, even impact investing, the way it has evolved, and social finance here in Quebec, what we call socially responsible finance, it's in all sectors. Where it's distinct is that it is not only driven by profitability, it is driven by, we've called it triple bottom line, or multiple objectives, social, environmental, governance objectives. So it isn't, and in fact, we have argued here for many, many years, and quite successfully, that this is not to replace public provision of social services. Social finance should step in to be able to democratize the economy, democratize access to finance, design economic development strategies that are inclusive. Community bonds is an example of a social finance tool, and we've launched a few here quite successfully in Quebec. And what's interesting about community bonds is that it also allows ordinary citizens to invest directly in a tool rather than put their money in the bank or wherever they would. So social finance is a very broad sector that covers all kinds of economic activity. There's one in Toronto called Solar Share, and it's been around for a long time, and it's a cooperative. I don't know if anybody here is aware of it, and it provides energy. And then they've got another one called BioShare, which uses methane gas and converts methane gas into energy. BioShare, yeah. And these are all community bonds that people like you and I have a share in. I bought bonds for the Cinéma du Parc. So it's a way that you can also engage people, social capital, as we call it, social cohesion.
There's a financial return to them too.
Yeah, stable financial return,
Just
long
one
term.
important thing is it's a complete. I would say it's
The opposite. Absolute opposite of.
Intermediation. It's like people investing directly, whereas in the social impact bonds you have a very complicated system, where, and it was mentioned in the film, a lot of people have to be paid to take part.
The architecture of a social impact bond, and you would have seen it, is extremely complex, very, very complex and very expensive.
I have another example of other financial tools, which is the solidarity finance institutions we have in Quebec. When you look at what they address, the portfolio of the Réseau d'investissement social du Québec is made of market failures, trust goods, jobs and training for people normally excluded from workplace, devitalized communities. So we have to look at other forms of seeing to the financial gaps that then the social impact bonds and other destinations to the social finance than just the social and the health.
I think we probably have to get going, yeah? So I want to thank our panelists very much for coming. I really appreciate you coming and sharing your experience in this with us. And thanks to the audience.